Hello folks, welcome to our continuing series on managing the family forest in Mississippi. I'm John Kushla, Extension Forestry Specialist for Northeast Mississippi, and I'll be talking to you today about natural regeneration. I've listed my contact information if you have a question about this program or any other question about forestry that might interest you. Of course, within the last 50 years, tree planting has become extremely common to the point where we forget that beyond those 50 years, this was pretty much how we grew all of our forests, from seed that fell on the ground from existing trees. And so I'll be talking to you about that lost art of natural regeneration. We'll discuss why use natural regeneration, and then we'll talk more about different natural regeneration methods for pine and even-aged management as well as uneven-aged management, and then go into natural regeneration for hardwoods as well as mixed stands. But first I want to begin with a little bit description of our forests in Mississippi. We have nearly 20 million acres of commercial forest, and nearly 2/3 of the state, predominantly hardwoods. It represents a $22 billion industry to the state of Mississippi, nearly 200,000 jobs, 6 billion wages, and 9.5 billion in value-added processing. And this includes all of the major sectors of forest industry: the logging, pulp and paper, solid wood, furniture, and wildlife recreation. The unit costs for mechanical site preparation and prescribed fire will be greater on smaller land holdings. Now, fortunately, chemical site prep costs have remained consistent across different tract sizes. Landowners should be able to collaborate together to get work done on nearby lands and save money on their site preparation and planting costs. Cost shares may also be available to help smaller non-industrial private forest owners. And there are opportunities for smaller owners to lower costs with natural pine regeneration because you're not paying to buy and plant seedlings. And this is the preferred method for hardwood regeneration. So what are more of the advantages? Well, lower costs. Like I said, you're only paying for site preparation cost. It's more aesthetically appealing. Non-industrial forest owners favor longer rotations for high-value products. Even in our depressed markets, saw timber prices are about 3.5 times pulpwood price, which you can find online from the Mississippi State University Extension webpage. And there's a potential for even better prices for premium grade saw timber. Now, you are limited when doing natural regeneration to the genetics on site. What you have is what you have to work with. So you'll always want to favor cutting the worst trees and keeping the best trees. Here's a diagram of how even-aged management works for natural pine regeneration. You start at a beginning of a rotation by setting seed. Notice that it takes several years for seed fall to get an adequate stand. Then you grow that stand, and while you're growing it, you're doing intermediate treatments such as thinning or release or prescribed burning. And then you do what's called a reproduction cutting. Now notice that it doesn't all happen in 1 year. It takes several years to do the reproduction cutting to get the seed for the next forest. And we'll talk about that now, what's involved. Now you can use clear cutting in natural pine regeneration under certain circumstances. But remember, of course, your seed source are from trees adjacent to the clear cut. So the clear cuts should be small and or narrow. And of course, you're going to need to require site preparation. Now, the only time you might not do, say, prescribed burning for a clear cut is if you plan to use seed in place. In other words, pine cones scattered about in logging slash on site. Of course, if you burn that, you're going to kill that seed source, and you'll rely just on seed fall from adjacent trees. Now, another method is called the seed tree method, where you retain a small number of saw timber sized trees as a seed source. So you do not harvest all your trees. And these seed trees need to be distributed evenly across the site. You want to allow good seed dispersal within the range of these seed trees. Now I want to digress and talk about a concept called basal area, because we use that extensively in forestry when we talk about stand management. And basal area is nothing more than the accumulated cross-sectional area of the trees on the site, taken at a cross-section of 4.5 feet above the ground. So the area of a circle, if you recall, is pi r squared. So we measure diameter, we divide it in half and square it, and we measure basal area in square feet per acre. So we convert those square inches by using the 144 square inches per square foot. Now, when we talk about the number of trees that are left for a seed tree cut, we're looking at about 4 to 15 saw timber sized trees, with a residual basal area of about 5 to 20 square feet per acre. Just to give you a reference point, a 14-inch diameter tree is about 1 square foot of basal area per acre. A 19-inch tree is about 2 square feet of basal area per acre. And at the bottom of the slide, you see our formula for calculating basal area with the conversion factor using diameter at breast height measured in inches. Now, I mentioned you have to space these trees evenly. For a seed tree cut, you want to leave 10 trees per acre. There are 43,560 square feet in an acre, so you divide that by 10 and take the square root, and you will get 66 feet between residual trees. You have 2 harvest operations in a seed tree cut. The first harvest is to leave the seed trees, and these would be saw timber sized trees that are good seed producers. Not all trees are good seed producers, so you favor the best producers. You want them to be straight and wind firm. You don't want to see any defects in the bole that might lead to their breakage in high winds, and you want to see an open crown so that the canopy doesn't act like a sail and lead to a broken top in case of a strong wind. You want to apply site preparation at this point after your harvest to eliminate competing vegetation and expose mineral soil, such as a herbicide spray and a prescribed burn. You will then leave these trees for several years, perhaps 5 to 10 years, and then you will do what's called the removal cut. After you've established advanced regeneration, over 1,000 trees per acre that are 2 to 3 feet tall, you would come in then and remove those crop trees. Seedbed preparation is very important. You need to have exposed mineral soil. Sometimes you will get disturbance from logging will be adequate, but if not, you'll have to do some sort of site preparation. And this is going to be very important because you may have several years of a marginal seed crop, and good site preparation will lead to better germination and survival. So a real-life example, Western Gulf Loblolly-Shortleaf. Both of these species of southern pine are among the most extensive distribution in the southeast. Both are highly adaptable to a wide range of soil and site conditions. Virtually any regeneration method can be used, even-aged or uneven-aged. Here we're talking about even-aged regeneration. And the key to success is that the seed crops are good 75% of the time, and you usually will leave the seed trees there for about 5 years, get very good advanced regeneration, and then thin the stand as saplings. Now the next method of a seed tree cut is a modification called a Shelterwood. You leave more trees than with the seed tree method. And the cutting is in 3 periods. There's a preparation cut to eliminate competing trees and allow the crop trees to grow to size and produce a big canopy for a good crop. Then you make your Shelterwood cut about 5 years later. And then you would allow the seed to fall and germinate 5 to 10 years before doing your removal cut. Now the preparatory cut objective is cone production. So you would cut competing trees and allow your future seed trees room to expand their crowns and root systems. Oftentimes, if you're doing regular thinning, you can use the last thinning in the rotation to suffice for your preparatory cut. Then you do your Shelterwood cut. You would allow a residual stocking of 15 to 30 trees per acre. And again, these are saw timber sized trees. They should be good seed producers, straight, wind firm, just as with a seed tree. And if necessary, you need to perform site preparation after your logging, before you let seed fall. So here's a comparison of the 2 methods of even-age regeneration. For seed tree, about 10 trees per acre, spaced about 66 feet apart. Typical basal area left would be about 18 square feet per acre with a approximate volume of 1,900 board feet using the Doyle rule. If it's a Shelterwood, you would want to leave at least 20 trees per acre. They would be spaced nearly 47 feet apart with an approximate basal area of 35 square feet per acre and an approximate volume of 3,800 board feet Doyle. Now on the removal cut, you're harvesting those seed trees. So you need to wait until you have a well-established advanced regeneration, about over 1,000 trees per acre, at least 2 to 3 feet tall. And this may take 5 to 10 years, depending on how good the seed crops are. When is the Shelterwood method preferred? Well, species in which seed production is low or erratic are prime candidates for this method of natural regeneration. The extra seed trees often make the difference between regeneration success and failure. And an example would be longleaf pine management. This is from the Escambia experimental forest in southern Alabama. Optimal seed crop of the residual basal area would be between 30 to 40 square feet per acre. Now longleaf, interestingly, if you leave fewer trees, you do not get a consequent increase in the number of cones per tree. So below 30 square feet of basal area, you're not going to get an advantage, offsetting advantage of more cones. So you're just as well use a Shelterwood to do your regeneration. After seed fall and you get existing advanced regeneration, longleaf pine seedling stays in a grass stage for a number of years, growing a root system. At that point, it's susceptible to a disease called the needle blight. And controlled fire, burning off all of the old needles, stimulates the tree to produce new needles and eliminates the disease. So it will start stem development at that time. Now, there are also uneven-aged methods of regeneration. These are imitations of later stages of succession. We sometimes call this all-aged silviculture. So we're using small openings scattered within and throughout the stand. So the forest is managed as a whole, and tree size proxies for tree age. So here's a diagram of what we would be doing with uneven age silviculture. Rather than having a rotation age, we have what's called a cutting cycle. And we do all of our manipulation of the stands during that cutting cycle. So at different parts of the forest, we're doing reproduction cutting, preparatory cuts. We're doing thinning and other intermediate cuts, as well as regeneration. So we're removing residual crop trees. So we're all doing those at the same time, each cutting cycle across the entire forest. So the mechanics in uneven age silviculture, we have subunits of the stand that are treated differently. And cutting is done in all age classes. And again, the guiding rule is you want to cut the worst and leave your best. Because as with all natural regeneration methods, you have to use the genetics that are available on site. So you want to use the best looking trees that you can. Now the advantages of uneven aged management is that you have a continuous forest cover, which is aesthetically appealing. You can grow large trees of very high quality saw timber and take advantage of that price differential for saw timber and larger products. Because you're using a cutting cycle as opposed to the rotation age to manage this stands in the forest, you get a much more frequent periodic return to the landowner. And it is a very useful method for restoring understocked stands. Now, the disadvantage of using uneven age silviculture is that pine trees don't like shade. So there's a balancing act in your cutting that you have to follow that will permit adequate regeneration. You also don't get nearly the amount of fiber production in lower value products like pulpwood and chip and saw that you do with plantation management. And since seedlings are constantly being added to the stand, that is, you're doing regeneration work across the forest, you're limited in tools that you can apply, meaning it's very difficult to apply prescribed burning. So what are the keys to success for uneven aged management? First, you need to establish your pine reproduction. Even poorly stocked stands can be recovered within 20 years. And of course, if necessary, you will have to use site preparation, particularly with herbicides. The proper intensity of cutting is very important. You don't want to cut too little, otherwise you don't get enough light for the trees. And you don't want to cut too much, or you'll lose volume production over the life of the forest. And you have to be diligent about sticking to your cutting cycle because this is how you're balancing volume production versus reproduction of the forest over time. And finally, with pine management, the succession, natural succession, is that pines will revert to hardwood in the absence of fire. And so because we're using all-aged management and fire is excluded, you have to intervene with herbicides to control unwanted vegetation periodically, usually every other cutting cycle, to keep hardwoods under control so you can maintain your pine forest. So how would you implement uneven age management? There's two methods. Usually one's called group selection and the other is single tree selection. And we'll compare both. With group selection, you have openings, small openings, which can be used as a logging deck. They can be site prepared. If you're careful, you can even apply burning to that logging deck. And for pine and oak seedlings that prefer open conditions for establishment, you'll have enough light to get reproduction established. Now, the downside to group selection versus single tree management is that you do get a moth-eaten appearance across the landscape. And of course, the larger openings resemble small clear cuts. Now, I might add, though, a downside of single tree management is that you won't get adequate reproduction, and you can lead to degrading the stand over time. And we'll talk more about that with hardwood management. With group selection, the openings created in the stand are used for obtaining their seedlings for reproduction. And the openings can vary in size. They must be at least 1.5 to 2 times the tree height. Often they're between 1/2 to 2 acres maximum. So the clearings would be about 150 to 330 feet in diameter. Now, for single tree selection, you're harvesting, 1 or maybe 2 trees at a time, creating much smaller openings, generally under 1/2 an acre. And the continued development of regeneration depends on subsequent cutting in the cutting cycle. So you have to be very diligent about doing your other types of preparatory and thinning cuts to get the regeneration you need in these very small openings. Now, the loblolly pine forest in the Crossett experimental forest is a case example of uneven aged forest management. The Forest Service acquired this property in the mid-30s. It was acquired for soil conservation and watershed purposes. It was degraded forest land. On the good parcels, the good farm 40, so to speak, stocking was about 5,100 square feet of basal area per acre. But on the poor farm 40, you had, about half of that kind of residual basal area. Stand conditions in 1937, there were a few large trees that escaped the 1915 harvest, the last harvest. And there was then subsequent reproduction in that 15 to 20 year period. And there were also plenty of hardwoods. Now, using uneven age management, both stands reached full stocking in 15 years, even those on the poor farm 40. And the pictures you see are examples of harvested products from both the good farm 40 on the top and the poor farm 40 on the bottom. And you'll see they're very similar in terms of the amount of forest products and the different types. Saw timber and pulpwood. And you can obtain a reasonably similar amount of growth on both. The basal area growth was about 3 square feet of basal area per acre per year, or about 400 board feet per acre per year on the Doyle rule. So what makes it work? Well, like I mentioned, management of the overstory is very important, light versus shade. You need to maintain your volume growth of the overstory, but you also have to provide enough light to keep your seedlings alive and vigorously growing. So proper balance of that residual basal area is very important. And for the Crossett forest, 60 square feet of basal area per acre was their target. Below about 45 square feet per acre, you lost volume production of the entire forest. Above about 75 square feet of basal area per acre, you did not get enough pine regeneration. So you see that 60 square feet of basal area was their tipping point for maintaining both consistent volume production and consistent reproduction. And you want to see a minimum height growth of about 1/2 foot per year. Now I'm going to digress a little bit and talk about another concept we use in forestry called live crown ratio. And this is the relative height of the crown from the base of the canopy to the very top in relation to the total height of the tree expressed as a percentage. And the live crown ratio is very important in predicting which trees are going to respond to release, that is, the removal of competition for light. You want to see a tree, and we're focusing on that rather medium-sized tree right in the center of the upper right photo. We want to see a live crown ratio of at least 20% with a 2-inch diameter at the base of that live crown. And we want to see good apical dominance as indicated by that prominent leader as shown in that tree in the middle. Now, one of the benefits that you get from uneven age management is a relative uniform diameter growth as shown by the lower photograph, where you have relatively evenly spaced rings close together, producing a very high quality saw timber. So what are some of the ways you can regulate uneven aged management? Well, volume would be a guide. You basically cut your growth every cutting cycle. So at 400 board feet per acre per year times 5, you would be cutting about 2,000 board feet per acre. For your overall situation. Now you can use structure. Now the graph that's shown on the right indicates what we look at for an uneven aged management. You have an inverse J-shaped curve where you have a lot of very small trees, and as the trees get bigger in size, you have fewer and fewer and fewer of them. And the line that you see is the target residual basal area as a function of the maximum diameter to be retained in each diameter class. And so you would try to cut that volume growth in each diameter class every cutting cycle. Or you can regulate your stand by area with a simple formula, A over R, where A is area and R is rotation age. So if you had 40 acres and you wanted to manage it on a 40-year rotation age, you would divide 40 acres by 40 years. You would cut 1 acre per year. If you had a 5-year cutting cycle, that means you would cut 5 acres every 5 years. And of course, this would not be in all one spot. That would be distributed across the forest. So now we're going to talk about successful natural regeneration for hardwoods. And we're going to be using and borrowing from these same concepts that we discussed for pine. But now we're thinking about hardwoods, and primarily we're wanting to look at what sort of merchantable species do we have? Do we have enough desirable species on a stand to manage that hardwood stand? And by desirable, I'm meaning oak species. For the most part, these are the commercial hardwoods that we want to see on the site, the different oak species. We want at least 200 trees per acre that are in the 8 to 10 inch diameter class. Or we want to see 40 to 50 trees per acre, or crop trees that are about 20-inch diameter. So if we have sufficient desirable trees, then we can consider managing that stand for natural reproduction. We would first want to conduct what's called timber stand improvement, and this can begin at any age. Usually the earlier in the stand development, the better. You want to remove the unwanted hardwoods in that stand. Smaller trees that are non-merchantable, you would use stem injection with herbicides. Bigger trees you could remove with merchantable production of pulpwood cuttings, but you don't want to remove to the basal area below 50 square feet per acre at this point in time. You want to maintain your basal area a little bit above that when you do your thinnings. Now, if you want to manage your hardwood stand an even-aged regeneration, you would again apply cutting in stages. You would do a preparatory cut where you remove lower quality trees to release the crown to produce a good acorn crop. And again, you want to keep your residual basal area to about 50 square feet per acre or slightly more. And I would encourage you to use the Shelterwood. We're talking about oak as the predominant species, and these are a heavy seeded tree. So Shelterwood would probably give you better distribution of seed across the site. And you can remove as many as 50% of your oaks without significantly affecting your acorn crop. So you would make a Shelterwood cut about 5 to 10 years after your preparatory cut. And again, you would let them grow for 5 to 10 years, dropping seed to get advanced regeneration. And you want to see a great deal of advanced generation, about 20 to 30,000 trees per acre, 2 to 3 feet tall. Remember, when you come in to log your residual trees, you're going to be running over a lot of that advanced regeneration. So there is a great deal required for maintaining the stand. Another way to think of even-aged management of hardwoods is what we call crop tree management. Develop a list of desirable species that you want on your property, and you can talk to the mills in your area, see what they're buying, and use that as a list. And then you would grid your stand into squares 31 feet on a side. This would represent 45 squares per acre. And then within each square, you would select one tree to manage as your final crop tree. So you would base all your management decisions, whether it's timber stand improvement and then your reproduction cuts, subsequent reproduction cuts, based on that one crop tree in each square grid on the site. Now you can use uneven-aged regeneration methods for hardwood management, but we would recommend you use the group selection, where you're having 1/2 to 2 acre size cuts, because you're going to get enough sunlight for your desirable species to grow. Oaks need at least 50% sunlight during the day to regenerate. Otherwise, the seedlings will die. So we would discourage you from using single tree selection. Unfortunately, this technique has been abused for many years and has led to high grading of our hardwood forests, which means they cut the best each time they harvest and leave the worst, which degrades the stand over time. And it also tends to favor shade-tolerant species, which unfortunately are not desirable. If we can't market them, they're not desirable, and we shouldn't have them in the stand. So we want to remove them early on as we can. And finally, we'll talk about mixed pine-hardwood regeneration. Some folks want to have both. From a forestry point of view, on upland sites, I prefer to see pine management because value-wise, you can grow 2 crops of pine to every 1 crop of hardwood. But some folks want to see mixed stands. And the best way to manage for a mixed stand is to start with one to begin with. So if you have adequate stocking of desirable hardwoods, that is oak, as well as a few pine, you can manage for mixed pine management. It's very hard to control, though, the actual amount of pine you're going to see in your reproduction. But as long as you have pine out there, you will have a pine component in your next forest. And we use what I call a modified Shelterwood cut. You would have oak Shelterwood about 20 to 25 trees per acre. And then you would leave pine seed trees, about 5 to 10 trees per acre. You would use that for your reproduction. And you would manage it just as you would Shelterwood. You would do your timber stand improvement, then your preparatory cut, your Shelterwood cut, and then final removal of your residual trees. The other method would be group selection for uneven aged management of your mixed pine-hardwood forest. So what are some parting thoughts? Well, for natural pine regeneration, you entail lower costs. You're not buying seedlings and paying to have them planted. You can take advantage of longer rotations to produce quality saw timber to get the best prices for your forest products when they are merchantable. And it's a great method to rehabilitate understocked or cutover stands with uneven aged management methods. But always remember when using natural regeneration that you want to cut the worst and leave the best because you are limited to the genetics that are on site. When it comes to hardwoods, natural regeneration is the preferred method for hardwood management because these trees take so long to grow, upwards of 60 to 70 years for a rotation. It very rarely pays to plant hardwoods, so you want to use natural hardwood regeneration when you have adequate stocking of desirable, that is, merchantable species, your oak species. And when you do, then you would use your multiple cutting regimes of timber stand improvement, whether it's by cutting or stem injection, your preparatory cut, which removes pulpwood, then your crop tree and residual tree harvest. I want to thank you for your interest in the Mississippi State University Extension Service.